coming at you all the way live. This is not a revolution, or this is this is revolution. Oops, I messed up. That being said, today I have with me a returning guest and friend of show, Shahid Buttar. Shahid Buttar is running for Congress against probably one of the most powerful people in politics, Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi has been in Congress since 1987. She is one of the richest people in Congress as well. She, unlike a lot of the progressive challengers that we've seen win their primaries and even their races, the one thing Nancy Pelosi is that a lot of those other challengers aren't is a household name. She has made a brand, especially during the Trump era, as the hashtag resistance to the Trump administration. Her action, politically, not so much. But because of the bluster of Donald Trump and the dumpster fire of his presidency, it has enabled Nancy Pelosi to do some amazing grandstanding and keep herself atop the Democratic Party. So here steps a challenger to her left for the first time. He ran against her in 2018, garnered a good amount of votes, but he ran very last minute. This time around, actually built a campaign, very, very grassroots. I believe Shahid Buttar raised over $1 million, taking no big corporate money. Nancy Pelosi has raised $14 million. So this is what we're up against. And as Shahid Buttar's campaign was gaining quite a bit of steam in left politics, he finally got a nice piece in the Chronicle. Nancy Pelosi's election challenger says she's not progressive enough and she's ignoring it. Where, there's a picture of him debating an empty chair, very Clint Eastwood-esque. Because Nancy Pelosi is truly avoiding this challenge. She has not debated since she ran initially in 1987.
They put that story on the front page. It was above the fold, which I was grateful for as well. And the print story, I think the headline was even better, as something like Pelosi ignoring calls for debate.
Oh, I saw that. I got excited. I shared it on all my social media. 7 days later, an entire different headline is in the Chronicle. Shahid Buttar, Nancy Pelosi's election opponent, accused of sex harassment. And it totally changes the tone of the election from one of the powerless against the powerful to Me Too against misogynist man. Shahid, thank you for listening to my long-winded intro.
Thank you for bringing me on and a chance to talk about it.
Now, first off, there is an allegation from a woman that says about 17 years ago, you guys knew each other in the same D.C. scene. Am I right? D.C.?
D.C., yeah. I lived in Washington, D.C. for 2 different stints, 5 years each. And I did know Liz Croydon back in the early 2000s.
And says that you were pushy and wanted to have sex with her. And
that is definitely not true. And yeah, happy to.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, she claims that I pursued her for intimacy, which I never did. And she claims an interaction in which I shamed her for celibacy, which I also never did. The parts of her story that are true are that I did start a community. I started the DC Guerrilla Poetry Insurgency, and then I started a group called the Belmont House. And at our house, we frequently held gatherings, and Liz correctly describes it as sort of a hub for the local creative, activist, artist community. And she came through. I don't think I've ever been in a room alone with her, and I've certainly not ever indicated any interest in her at any point, let alone over time. And I would just say that with as other people have had an opportunity to write about the facts, a different story has emerged than when the first press reports ran.
Now, when the news first came out, you basically said everybody should be heard, and if a woman says these allegations were made, they need to be investigated.
Yep, and I feel very strongly about that. Any accusation should be investigated. That's absolutely true, and I'll stand by that. I'm not gonna say anything that's gonna inhibit anybody who has a story to tell from coming forward. That's my first commitment in all this.
So I know some investigative work was done, and some people came out and debunked the story, if you will, by calling out this woman's repeated lies that she's told about other people.
Yeah, when I say when you said investigative work was done, I'm so grateful to the journalists who've done that work. You mentioned the San Francisco Chronicle. Mission Local was another outlet that I generally respect that just frankly printed lies, basically. There's no other word for it. And as the journalists who took greater attention and care to detail and interest in the facts explored those facts, a very different set of characters emerged than the ones depicted in the first news stories. My experience with Liz, in addition to having shared a microphone with her at a couple of different events, she's accused me of a whole range of things going back the better part of 10 years. And, none of that makes the story. And I only knew about my experience with Liz. I've frankly been astounded to learn, because I've been learning from these same investigative reports that have been emerging about the history there. And I didn't know half of what I've learned from the journalists. There's one in particular, Jacqueline Thompson, who's been writing, and I knew some of those stories. Like I knew literally two of those stories, but the rest of them, as I read them, it's even, because I only knew Liz from DC. I didn't know her in LA. Apparently there's a whole scene in LA that had a not dissimilar experience with her from what we did in DC. And the press in San Francisco, not caring to investigate any of this, printed her allegations as if, they were substantiated, which, not only were they not substantiated, but it's very easy to substantiate what they are. And the truth is not it.
And to double down on, I should say double down. Yeah. So I think what made the story for a lot of people hit a lot harder, even in the original Chronicle article, was then the fact that several staffers had departed. So I think the story on its head probably wouldn't have held as much water. But once you then pile on that, all these staffers left, the campaign manager was Jasper the campaign manager.
Yeah, my former campaign manager and the finance director, who was with us for about 6 weeks, and then a handful of other staff left. The news reports presented it as if it was a dozen people who had left in a wave, which was not true at all. And I think, to your point, the idea that some of my staff had felt like they'd encountered misogyny in the workplace made the allegation of harassment that much more seemingly credible, I think, in the eyes of some people reading the story.
Mm-hmm.
And, all I can say about the observations of the claims by my former staff are that I can't refute their experience. Their feelings are real, whatever my intentions. And I certainly never intended to treat anybody differently. I've never intended to treat anybody differently. And I've never heard, incidentally, I've never heard any allegation of misogyny in the workplace, either when I worked with these people or in any of the other workplaces that I've been in, or with any of the people that I've worked with since. The first time in my life I'd ever been accused of anything resembling misogyny was when these news reports surfaced. And, among the things that I found sort of confusing was that when each of these people had left the campaign, we'd had conversations. And my understanding of it at the time was that it was about strategic differences. We did have strategic differences. We had very frank conversations, and each of them chose to do other things because, I had a campaign I needed to run, and I needed to recruit the people who I'm working with now in order to build it. And the folks I was working with then, they had a different vision of what they wanted to do. And it was never presented to me as anything resembling or relating to a gendered experience. We did learn at one point that my former staff had reached out to Liz, and I'm not going to comment on the ethics of that. I do think that the stories being presented together is, to say the least, interesting. And there is an open story to be told about how those things got combined. I mean, how the idea that I supposedly harassed someone 20 years ago in DC relates to the idea that I've been a misogynist in the campaign is elusive to me, at least. And I don't exactly see how those things fit. It's also one of the things that my team was very confused by was the fact that the news outlets that ran the first set of stories, they were getting press releases with embargoes, meaning to say, like, it was a very sophisticated effort to place these stories. And that is a little disturbing to think about in retrospect.
Do you feel like, before we get into maybe some more questions about what happened per the story, do you feel like this is one of those instances of a Democratic Party flex?
Maybe not directly. I mean, it could be. I can't say. I mean, I would say that if somebody wanted to derail a promising revolutionary campaign to challenge an entrenched incumbent, that rather than physically assassinate someone, character assassination is an easier way to do it. Is it? I can't prove who it would have come from. It could just as easily have come from the powerful Democratic Party, an intelligence agency, or just, a disgruntled staff person, career political operative wanting to protect their future job prospects. Much of the progressive establishment in San Francisco remains beholden to Pelosi, even though she's no progressive, just because she is the most powerful person in the party. And any of those people, frankly, would share an interest in derailing our efforts. So it's hard to, frankly, identify where an intention might have come from. But I would say that the most charitable explanation, and the one, the shoe that seems the most fitting to me, is just that my colleagues, my former colleagues, developed a sincere concern based on the accusations of someone who unfortunately was not very trustworthy, and then came to internalize a narrative that led them to reconsider their time working together. The unfortunate reality here is that in reconsidering their time together, the people that they've accused of extend far beyond myself, because a number of volunteers have come forward basically with reflections that challenge those of the people I used to employ on the campaign. And all of them have been accused now of lying by my former staff, as well as my current staff and some of my supporters. So it's gotten much bigger than the original accusation, if only because my former staff have now accused so many different people of lying. And, that is unfortunate. And, the way it's driven a lot of once allies to opposition is disappointing.
Wow. This is a heavy one. So in some of these allegations that are raised against you, your campaign manager, and maybe one of the heavier allegations that has been kind of this thread, said that they had to arrange your schedule, even your sex times.
That was the most outrageous part of the whole piece. I don't even know where to start with that. I mean, so first of all, campaign managers often manage the calendar for candidates. I mean, to be perfectly frank, I didn't know when I was free. You know, I worked 7 days a week, 6 nights. I'd have like 1 night off a week. And people in my life occasionally would ask when I could be free. And my answer normally was, I don't know. There's other people you could ask. And I'd point them to Jasper. One of my partners suggested some offense at Jasper's presumption that when she was scheduling a night for me not to work, that she was leaping to the presumption that I'm having sex with somebody. I mean, in a lot of those cases, I was just having dinner with somebody. So like, I don't understand how that gets, you know, inflated in somebody's mind, or for that matter, published. Like, it's just such a wildly outrageous claim to make. And frankly, it's not like how do I put this? The insinuation into my life and being a go-between me and other people, that was not something I ever welcomed. And it, you know, it was uncomfortable at the time, and clearly in retrospect is even more uncomfortable given how it's been, you know, sort of weaponized. I would say also, you know, I have a non-traditional relationship paradigm, and the idea that I was outed by my former campaign manager, I think to people who have any kind of like commitment to, you know, whether it's the autonomy of people to have their lives and their choices and define themselves and their orientations and their sexual practices as they choose, I think those people might be particularly alarmed that, you know, campaign staff are outing people's relationship paradigms. You know, I'm not running for office based on who or how I date. And, you know, I think my partners, in at least some cases, felt a great deal of offense by that. And, you know, there was enough else in the post for me to be offended by, frankly, that it almost felt like a drop in a bucket, but it did feel particularly malicious and, yeah, not particularly true. I would say that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, this was these guys' first major campaign, and with the positions that they had, right?
That's right. Yeah, I hired folks into roles that they hadn't played before. Largely because when you run against someone like the Speaker of the House, you don't have the most experienced people knocking down your door to work with you. I mean, I'm running the most uphill fight in the country. There is no climb in politics steeper than the one that I've taken on. And, you know, when we set out at the outset, I think a lot of people looked at me with a great deal of skepticism. And I can understand why. I'm an immigrant with no property challenging the most powerful corporate politician on the planet. And it makes perfect sense for people to be skeptical. But, you know, what I know that I think a lot of people didn't think about at the time was that it's not me, it's us. And I don't have a great deal of, it's not me that I have faith in. I have a lot of faith in us with a capital U. And, you know, no corporate politician is a match for us, which is why, as we've proceeded and the campaign's gotten stronger and stronger, you know, the us that I expected to rally around the campaign, you know, that happened, the campaign grew. As the former staff found their way to other opportunities, and I filled their shoes with new folks who I've worked with since who do have that experience. I mean, the campaign has just jumped through the roof. You know, our fundraising doubled within 2 months of me getting the old finance director off the team, for instance. And it doubled in 2 months. I mean, and from a pretty substantial baseline, right?
You were working for like a year and a half, 2 years.
He was only with us for 6 weeks, but yeah, I by this point had been in the campaign for about a year, and as soon as I got, you know, teammates who align with me as opposed to struggled with me, you know, predictably we just started doing better. I had a lot of challenges with my former staff that I do certainly regret ever coming to points of tension. I had never regarded that as gendered. And again, when they left my team, according to what they told me and my current staff, neither did they. They came to see it as gendered after encountering this person who claimed falsely to have been harassed by me. And that sequence of events is unfortunate. As I look at that post with Jasper, the thing that most jumps out at me is just how so many of the things that she claims in that post are just seem so wildly out of character for the person I am. And, I think that's why so many volunteers have come forward to write and speak their own truths, having recognized that the character constructed in that post just differs and diverges wildly from the person that, everybody who's ever known me knows me to be.
And since the old staff is gone, even your staffers have grown, right? Your volunteer team has gotten bigger, right?
Yeah, everything's gotten bigger. The volunteers have grown, the calls have grown, the social media audience had grown, the traditional media had grown, like everything. What the former staff was basically relating to almost like the junior varsity version of the campaign that they were working on. And since they left, we basically just stepped into a whole new phase. And that might be another reason why, you were asking before, like, is it Pelosi on the other end of it? And obviously neither can I prove that, nor even would I claim it. But, among the possible motivations that someone might be inclined to bring forth a set of accusations like this might just be the fact that what they left went on to be so much bigger without them. And, I'm sure that's something that maybe they have feelings about.
In such a grassroots campaign like you have, here you are, you finally got that front page article. How do you feel right now with what between the article that came out 7 days later and the social media response? Twitter kind of blew up, and definitely there's a team Shahid, team everything else side. How do you feel right now?
Sort of like I'm at the front end of a 21 car pileup, like I'm going along, I'm doing my thing, I'm advocating for climate justice and racial justice, I'm fighting Trump and Pelosi's support for him, and then I get rammed by this set of accusations. And then behind that come all these secondary and then tertiary impacts, whether it's the Democratic Socialists of America, racing to rescind their endorsement without even a shred of interest in exploring the facts, like just a complete presumption of guilt based on accusation, affirmatively rejecting witnesses with information and burying its head in the sand. That was disappointing. And that was like another car hitting the pileup. And then that organization's process was itself taken advantage of by my accusers to gin up another round of stories that then, added to the pileup. And then the volunteers started coming forward saying that they'd been recruited by my former staff to participate in what one of those volunteers had described in terms that, are salacious. And then it just started being, basically everybody's accusing each other of lying now. And I'm kind of at the middle of it, and I haven't accused anybody of lying. I'm not going to do that. I do know that some stories changed between the time when they left our campaign and when they brought forward Liz's story. And I know there's certainly a lot of ethical questions that come up along the way in terms of how those stories came to light, not just ethics and the figures involved, but particularly among the reporters. I mean, the idea of running accusations without fact checking them is especially alarming if you compare, well, I won't, but there's any number of other examples in the world today suggesting that the press is often much more hostile towards people with accusations than they prove to be in my case. And as a brown person, as a man of color, falsely accused by a white woman of a sexual impropriety, I know I'm not the first person to stand in these shoes. And I'm grateful, frankly, that it's not any worse for me, because I know how bad it's been for any number of other people who've dealt with the same thing. For me, the biggest way I feel, frankly, is just disappointed in so many people who have been so willing to just ignore facts and due process and the presumption of innocence and just, believe any accusation at the drop of a hat. That has been disappointing, especially as a person of color accused by a white woman in a mostly white city that has presumed to judge me for things I haven't done.
So do you feel that so let me back up a little bit. I had about 3 shows recently, and in those shows, either the Harper's letter or something about cancel culture has come up. I talked to the great Ben Burgess, and he mentioned it. I talked to Professor Gerald Horn, had mentioned something about it in the Harper's letter. What is your take now on the quote unquote cancel culture?
I didn't, see myself as frankly implicated in it before, though I certainly do now. I think that canceling people is a much easier alternative than actually doing the hard work necessary to build structural systemic change. And that's why I'm running for office, is to do the hard work of building structural systemic change. And I think the idea of rushing to, there's any number of ways to put this. On the one hand, if somebody does something problematic, maybe it makes perfect sense for people to deny them a megaphone, and I don't see any problem in that. What I do see a problem in is people racing to judgment without a concern for facts. And, when I'm certainly, for instance, a supporter of survivors, I'm a supporter of whistleblowers, and I'm a supporter of workers. And in this case, each of those voices got, to some extent, organized to promote a narrative very different from the truth in a coordinated effort. And, I don't think of that as doing the Me Too movement any favors. I certainly don't think it does any favors for racial equity to ignore the need for process when people are accused. Maybe I'd leave it at that.
So now there's a different conversation. I believe the way your former campaign manager's little essay was left, I don't want to say little essay, the way her essay was left was like, hey, this guy isn't the candidate to beat Nancy Pelosi. He's not the guy. And I feel like the conversation's changing a bit about, well, even if she gets out, that's just one vote. How do you feel about that? What is your response to that?
Even if she gets out, it's just one vote. Can you?
Yeah, like even if Shahid was to win, he's just one vote.
Oh, I mean, sure. I mean, yeah, I'm just one vote, except that the vote we'd be replacing is much more than one vote. I mean, she's the Speaker of the House. If we knock her out, that would be the loudest signal sent in Washington in a generation. I mean, AOC knocking out Crowley was a big deal because it was Pelosi's successor. If we knock the Queen out herself, that's the end of corporate rule. I mean, it's huge. And I'm just one vote. I'm not going to enter Congress as the Speaker. But frankly, the nature of my influence as a first-term congressperson will be a lot bigger than my vote because of who I will have removed to get there.
And maybe the district you represent as well, or no?
I hope so. I mean, I think San Francisco, is shifting a lot in a lot of different ways. I mean, I think it is perceived correctly as one of the epicenters of the technology industry. It's also, I think, correctly perceived as both one of the wealthiest and one of the most destitute congressional districts in the country. And, in a time of rising income inequality, to see it embodied and demonstrated here in one city so clearly, I do hope to have a chance to address at the national scale some of the problems that our city is dealing with in microcosm, because I think they do reflect broader national trends. Everything from the housing crisis, certainly the way our community is being torn and the racial disparities in COVID, the economic impacts of both the climate crisis and the pandemic, and all of the ways in which people are finding opportunities harder to come by. I think in each of those arenas, San Francisco is suffering many of the same things and enduring and surviving. many of the same things that other communities around the country are too.
That being said, our current president had a press conference Saturday where he enacted an executive order that he was going to continue some unemployment checks on the federal level for $300 a month, and the states that wanted to participate would have to come up with the other 25% to make it $400 a month. There was going to be no $1,200 checks, and the moratorium on evictions was defined extremely loosely, to say the least. What was your take on that Saturday press briefing?
Well, it's certainly inadequate, but it's not just a failing of the president. It's particularly a failing of Democrats and Nancy Pelosi, because if they did the work that we send them to Washington to do, it wouldn't be falling to our criminal jackass president to construct in an executive order what Congress should have passed in legislation 3 months ago, 5 months ago. There were several bills that passed in the wake of the pandemic, and those measures prioritized issues from giving tax breaks to millionaires, which Nancy Pelosi approved before canceling rents and mortgages. They included an expansion of paid sick leave to cover only 20% of the workforce, leaving 80% of the workforce in the unfortunate position of having to go to work or letting their families be hungry. And that's a really bad policy in the middle of a pandemic. And of course, corporate Democrats haven't showed up at any point for the Medicare for All solution, which would ensure that cost would no longer be a barrier to care. And I've often said that that was a brutal and vicious commitment before the pandemic. In the middle of a global pandemic, to deny anyone care because of cost, while recognizing that their health impacts everyone else's, it is senseless to the point of stupidity. And that's our national policy, with the support of corporate Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi.
Her being maybe the most powerful. So her response to that was to send out a prayer. A prayer for the sick, a prayer for the homeless, a prayer for the unemployed. That was her comeback at Trump. Did you see their prayer?
I appreciate her thoughts and her prayers. They're welcome and far from enough. Prayers for a public official are a poor substitute for policy. And there's plenty of policies she could adopt if she means it. I mean, if she prays that hard, maybe she could sign HR, or at least support HR 6515. That's the bill that would cancel rent and mortgages and provide government support for small landlords so that banks and corporate landlords absorb the cost of housing during this pandemic, as they should, both because they're better situated to deal with that burden and because we've bailed them out before. And frankly, in the right set of circumstances, we'll probably bail them out again. But who's never gotten a bailout in this country? Working people. And the idea that working people in the middle of an economic shutdown and, calamity, the likes of which we haven't seen in multiple generations, are supposed to be responsible for the cost of housing. There was an affordable housing crisis before all this started. And now that's turning into a mass eviction wave, an entirely preventable mass eviction wave, which will be, incidentally, not just vicious to the people who experience it, but catastrophic to the economy. If there is to be an opportunity to recover from this economically, we're not going to get there by kicking millions of Americans into the street. And that's exactly what our ignorant foreign policy does. And, the sequence of priorities for Congress has been entirely too deferential to the 1% and not the rest of us.
Shahid, I know you're busy. I know you have somewhere to be in a little bit. And is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
I'd reiterate one thing that maybe didn't come out before that I do feel the need just to, really draw a circle around. I was really disturbed when I read the reports that you mentioned from my colleagues and my accuser in Washington. It didn't, they were not accusations that I could dismiss, because I take really seriously those issues. And I am very much a man who aims to be an ally to women And I do want to dismantle toxic masculinity and the patriarchy. And the last thing I have any interest in doing is replicating those things, which is why it hurts so much, frankly, to be accused of those things. And it's prompted a lot of self-reflection. And I've checked in with people that I've known and worked with. And, just in an abundance of caution to make sure, that if I had a blind spot here, this isn't, something that I've just been thoroughly, ignorant of while perpetrating, and, just coming to understand that, whatever my intent and whatever my history and however people might have experienced me in the past, there are a set of people now who, for whatever set of reasons, have shared this set of experiences, and I own it and I acknowledge it. And whatever anybody might have encountered on my team that was gendered, I do apologize for that. And I've learned a lot, particularly about the distinction between intent and impact. And, I've very grateful, particularly in all this, just to have found my way to the colleagues who I work with now. I'm so grateful to be supported by a team that shares my vision. And the progress that we're making in the campaign, really demonstrates it. When these stories first hit, I was, it certainly created a headwind, but, thankfully, there is enough support for our vision in spite of the claims that as people have looked closer at the facts and, the unreliability of my accuser in Washington has become increasingly widely established. That support's come back, and I'm grateful to be on the other side of it. It is just a hell of a ringer to have gone through. And I don't think that the city of San Francisco has grappled yet with what it indicates about the progressive and even socialist establishment that it was so willing to embrace a race to judgment without considering facts and what that means for race and racial inclusion and people of color and all the things we aim to address. But to whatever extent this saga has, invited people to reflect on misogyny and gender, I think we have yet to even begin grappling with it through the lens of race. And I think that that's going to be a challenging one for many of my detractors to grapple with.
Yes, especially in a city like San Francisco.
Indeed.
I think we definitely downplay how lily white San Francisco is, and definitely when it comes to the further left you go, it gets a little whiter. And
yeah. So to press back on that, I mean, I don't even think, one of the unfortunate things about this is you don't have to be white to be racist, right? I mean,
real talk.
There's plenty of black cops out there, and what they do is no less racist just because of the color of their skin. We throw around racism as if it were an individual commitment, but it's not. Prejudice is individual, but racism takes a system. Racism takes a culture. It takes norms. It takes institutions. It takes groups to bury their heads in the sand and ignore evidence. It takes, a local political culture to race to judgment without allowing facts or, even considering them. It takes people, I don't think, can be, I'm using air quotes here, racist in the meaningful sense that we are describing now. Yes, Trump is a racist, but the reason Trump is a racist is because he's the president and he can effectuate his racism. I tell a story sometimes about this kid. His name was Jacob. When I was a child, I think kindergarten or first grade, I remember him saying to me in school one day that his mom said that my family, we were brown because we were dirty and needed to take a bath. And I remember at the time snickering to myself. I don't think I had the presence of mind to say it to him at the time, but I just remember thinking God, your mom must be such an idiot to think. and you could say that as a 5-year-old immigrant because that kid didn't have any power either. It was obvious to me that might have been prejudiced, but I can't say that Jacob was a racist. Jacob was at the bottom of the ladder himself, and racism takes power. And that's what I think is the thing that the city needs to grapple with. And I mean that as, this is a city that I have long loved. It's a city that I am committed to. It's a city that I aim to represent in Washington. Right. And I love so many aspects of the socio-political culture of San Francisco. And I am so discomfited by what has revealed itself to me in the last several weeks. And I hope that, other people in the city see fit to grapple with some of those same issues, even if they're not directly impacted by it in the same way that I have been.
Well, I will put a link, of course, to your campaign, as I usually do, in the show. Since you last spoke, we're on a lot more platforms, so a lot more people will get to hear this.
Right on.
Continued success in your campaign and your mission to overthrow the queen of the evil empire. Always got to keep the Star Wars metaphors in.
Thank you for the opportunity, brother. I appreciate the chance to check in, and it's always good to connect.
All right, well, don't hang up.